I'm Conor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to Heavy Hands. I am your host, Conor Ruebusch, and with me once again is Dr. Patrick Wyman. Pat, I'm very, very excited about this episode. UFC 202 is just around the corner, and we will be dedicating most of today's discussion to the welterweight rematch between featherweight champion Conor McGregor and lightweight Nate Diaz. It's a very interesting fight with a lot of layers to it. We will be talking about the style matchup, the result in the first fight, and what bearing it has on the rematch, the development that would be necessary for either guy to succeed at UFC 202, and where their careers might go from here on out. At the end of today's show, of course, I want to mention before we dive in, we'll be talking about the light heavyweight presumably number one contenders fight between Anthony Johnson and Glover Teixeira, as well as the welterweight match between Rick Story and Donald Cerrone, and the bantamweight contenders fight between Cody Garbrandt and Takeya Mizugaki. So first of all, Pat, why don't we jump right in? Nate Diaz, Conor McGregor. Let's run through the history of this bout and talk about the events that led up to the first fight at UFC 196.
Well, so I am so pumped for this fight. And I think kind of before we get into the history and the particularities of the matchup, it's important to remember, regardless of how you interpret their first fight, that it was a fucking awesome fight. Like, it was a really, really, really good fight. One of the 2 or 3 best fights of the year up to this point in the UFC. And it deserves to be remembered as that, and not in the kind of storm of bullshit and kind of weird skewed memories that have taken hold since then. Like, at the most basic level, this was an awesome fight, and more than anything else, that's why they should be running it back, is because it was really good and really exciting for the 9 minutes that it lasted, rather than thinking this is about McGregor's redemption or anything like that. Just focus on the fact that it was fun, and it was absolutely worth your money if you were a pay-per-view consumer that night.
You could take all of the extenuating factors out of the equation. You could take out the fact that it happened at welterweight, even though neither guy is used to fighting there. You could take out the fact that Nate Diaz only had 11 days notice. You could take out the fact that Conor McGregor was preparing for lightweight champ Rafael dos Anjos for the duration of his training camp. You could take out all of that and just see the action that occurred, and it would still be a fight worth rematching.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But what makes this a Conor McGregor fight is the fact that all of the rest of that matters.
Right. Exactly. It was a weird one. I keep wanting in my head to say to myself, I have this knee-jerk reaction where I'm like, that was the biggest upset I've ever seen. Bigger than Rousey Holm and all of that. But can it really be? There's so many other factors that go into this fight. It makes it so hard to get a good read on it. The fact that McGregor ballooned up 15 pounds, which is 25 total pounds over his usual fighting weight, just before the fight. The fact that Nate Diaz had very short notice. The fact that Conor McGregor seemed to have fallen in love with his own power. It's just so difficult to take that fight and make it an easy prediction of what happens next time, because there were so many other things involved.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of variables. Like, if you think of every fight as an equation with particular variables that you have to think about, be it athleticism, style, power, age, where you're at in terms of your career, mentality, and all of that. This fight has a bajillion other variables knocked into it for exactly that reason. You know, you've got all of the stuff with late notice, the shift in stylistic matchups from what McGregor was preparing for to what he ended up with. Diaz coming in fresh and rested, but also not trained for that specific opponent. And I think that all of those factors kind of play together. That I would say, as much as McGregor talks about, just fighting whoever's in front of him and not thinking too much about it. And the story is famous that when they switched from Aldo to Chad Mendes, he woke up from a nap, said yes, and then went back to taking a nap. That, leaving that aside, I think it's easy to overlook the fact that McGregor is a very carefully prepared fighter.
Yeah.
And I think that he does a lot of opponent specific training and brings in a lot of specific sparring partners for opponents. And like leaving aside, like, yes, it's very impressive that Diaz did that on 11 days notice, didn't look tired, nothing like that. But McGregor, I think, is a guy who does a lot of specific preparation. When you change opponents on 11 days notice, that's going to mess with you. Dos Anjos and Nate Diaz are very, very different fighters.
Yeah, I think we have often written and spoken of Conor McGregor as a pure pressure fighter, but he is very adaptable. He's an intelligent man, and there's no doubt about that. Whether he has the level of introspection necessary to overcome the faults that led to his first loss to Nate Diaz remains to be seen, but he is an intelligent man. Like you said, he does specific preparation for each opponent. A lot of the things that he used against Diaz were kind of clearly things that he intended to use against Rafael dos Anjos. And so I think this fight probably takes that to another level. The preparation for UFC 202, McGregor recently said he has sparred 412 rounds so far over the course of this 8-week camp. He has done tons of preparation. He had well-publicized sparring with Chris Van Heerden, who got upset because McGregor put only the highlights of his successes in one of his Mac Life videos. But he's been sparring with other tall, larger southpaw boxers that kind of replicate Diaz's approach. You have to imagine that in his sort of seclusion, he has re-upped that focus on training specific things for Nate Diaz. So I have no doubt that Conor McGregor will come in with different tactics prepared. Will come in with some weapons honed specifically to capitalize on what Nate Diaz brings to the table. The question is, can Conor McGregor overcome the style matchup? Because I think that, more than the specific weapons, is what hurt him the first time. More than the fact that he was prepared for Rafael dos Anjos, more than the fact that some of the punches he had put in hundreds of hours training didn't translate to an opponent with Diaz's frame, is the fact that Diaz, as a style, is, I think, always going to be a difficult one for a fighter like Conor McGregor to fight.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the kind of basic thing that we all need to bear in mind here as we're breaking this matchup down. That fundamentally, Nate Diaz is almost the worst case scenario stylistic matchup for Conor McGregor. He is also a southpaw, but he's a southpaw who has a much more educated, much more adaptable, much more variable lead hand. As a striker, he's taller, he's longer, he knows how to use that reach. As a boxer, he is a better fundamental boxer in terms of his command of footwork, his command of rhythm, his command of distance. If you get drawn into a boxing match with Nate Diaz, which is essentially what McGregor allowed to happen in the first fight, you are not going to win a boxing match with Nate Diaz, especially when you rely on your punch the way that Conor McGregor does. McGregor has built his game around his opponents not being able to handle the pop in his left hand. Yeah. When you have an opponent like Nate Diaz who is durable enough to take that left hand, suddenly that changes fundamentally what McGregor can do. It changes the realm of the possible for him in that fight. He's also built his game around being the faster-paced fighter. You're not going to work at a faster pace than Nate Diaz over a long stretch of time. You may be able to outwork him for short stretches, but not for the entire fight.
Yeah, so, and it's worth noting too that I think Nate Diaz has gotten quite recently markedly better as a fighter. He came into his fight with Rafael dos Anjos injured and looked pretty out of shape. He couldn't make the weight, which is, even for a guy like Nate, who cuts quite a bit to make lightweight, a pretty rare thing. I don't think he ever had any issues with actually missing the weight limit in the past. And yet when he came back for his follow-up fight with Michael Johnson, he looked absolutely shredded. It looked like he had maybe refocused his efforts on becoming a better fighter, and I think the fight bore that out. The action of the Michael Johnson fight showed a craftier Nate Diaz, who was now relying on the pretty impressive amount of experience he has built up as a UFC fighter, especially against southpaws. That's not something that Conor McGregor has fought often. He has usually been the southpaw, and as a result, he has the classic southpaw style more than Nate Diaz does. He relies pretty heavily on the left kick and the left straight. He works from inside angles a lot more than some southpaws do, but he has a pretty subtle understanding of lead foot control and angling to find the straight left. That's pretty much That's the bulk of his game. And Nate Diaz is, as you said, is very different. Educated lead hand, counter right hooks and slaps, let us not forget, sharp jabs, and 1-2s down the pipe. Nate is much more a classical boxer, of like the English classical boxing school. Long, straight punches, subtle footwork, staying at long range, and that's difficult for McGregor, who is not only used to being the southpaw against the orthodox fighter, but used to being the bigger guy.
Well, McGregor, I think it's fair to say that if you're looking at what Conor McGregor's game is designed to do, it's a game that is designed to beat smaller orthodox fighters.
Yeah.
That's his everything that he does in his game is designed around him being the taller fighter, or if not necessarily the taller fighter, the longer fighter, and the fighter who fights longer.
Yeah.
Right. So he wants to stick you on the end of his reach with those long rangy kicks, not so much with his jab, because again, this is about beating orthodox fighters, and more often than not, like if you're a southpaw fighter in MMA, you don't need your jab all that much. It can be a useful tool, but it's not strictly necessary in the way that it would be if you were a pure striker.
Yeah.
Right. So McGregor uses his kicks the way that a pure boxer like Nate uses his jab. He wants to drive you backwards with side kicks, with oblique kicks, with spinning kicks, with round kicks, with front kicks, stick you on the end of his reach, and then once you're there, he has the freedom to move. He has the freedom to set the pace. He can either come in with a sharp left hand, in which, because he's the longer fighter, he doesn't need to cover that much distance, or he can let you come to him, step back, and hit that gorgeous inside angle left hand, like the one that he used to finish Jose Aldo, or the one years ago that he used to finish Ivan Buchinger. Same punch, same setup, all of that. That is McGregor's bread and butter. One of those two things: either you're stuck on the end of his reach and he's just ramming left hands down the pipe, or you're coming at him, he's taking an angle and he's firing off the left hand as a counter. That doesn't work against an educated southpaw pure boxer like Nate Diaz, who can stick you on the end of his reach, who isn't going to be intimidated by the kicking game. When you've been kicked by guys like Rafael dos Anjos, you're not going to be worried about being kicked by Conor McGregor. Like it's a whole different kind of thing. And so for McGregor, he has to fundamentally adapt the things that he prefers to do in the cage to a very difficult stylistic matchup.
Yeah, suddenly he has to come around the shoulder of a southpaw who's taller than him rather than throwing the straight left down the middle. Suddenly he has to deal with a very consistent jab while he's doing it. I mean, for McGregor, that straight left has kind of, aside from measurement, it's taken the place of what a jab would normally do. That's the strike that he leads with. That's the one he uses to make people jump and to make people fear him. And that's the strike that he bases other strikes off of, whether it's the right uppercut or the left high kick. Conor McGregor uses that straight left primarily as his weapon, and it's just difficult. We saw how much he reached for Nate Diaz in their first fight. He just wasn't prepared to, despite the fact that he was going to fight Dos Anjos, he wasn't prepared for a southpaw of that kind, and he maybe wasn't as well prepared as he should have been for Dos Anjos. I think even against Dos Anjos, and I think both you and I were picking Dos Anjos over McGregor, right?
Yeah, we were. Mm-hmm.
And I think even against Dos Anjos, McGregor would have had a bit of a rude awakening dealing with a southpaw who doesn't elect to give him his kind of fight. The only other southpaw I think he fought recently was Dustin Poirier. And Dustin Poirier was really, really upset by the head games and still managed to connect cleanly before being knocked out just a minute and 46 seconds into that fight. So it really didn't tell us anything about how McGregor deals with southpaws. And I think it may really be a bigger weakness than he or anyone else realized going into the Dos Anjos fight. And it was definitely revealed to be a weakness in the Nate Diaz fight.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I think all of that makes a lot of sense. Like what would have been his saving grace against Dos Anjos, I think, had that fight gone down. I mean, I still would have felt comfortable picking Dos Anjos in that, but after watching him fight Diaz, I think he would have done better maybe than I would have expected, simply because he wouldn't be giving up so much height and reach.
Yeah.
Like that, it's not just that Nate jabs and that Nate throws a great straight left and that Nate has that subtle footwork. It's also he is the longer fighter. It's easy to get fixated on the reach and not what Nate does with it. But like Nate did a fantastic job of forcing McGregor to fight at long distance. So even in the first round, even when McGregor was landing some good left hands, even when he was exploding forward and covering that distance, even then, that was McGregor was winning the battle slightly while losing the war.
He was becoming a victim of his own success. I mean, each time he hit Nate Diaz, it was the result of reaching, and it basically he taught himself, or perhaps Nate helped to teach him, that he needed to reach and chase Nate to hit him with that left hand, and he kept going for it, and it exhausted him. And there is an element of a guy who is used to putting people away. McGregor said this himself. He said featherweights would have gone down from those punches. I don't know how much of this is promotion, but he also said, I think in an interview with ESPN, that he dominated Nate Diaz for the first 8 minutes and he ran out of gas, and basically that Nate got lucky. He said 1 or 2 more shots, he would have been wrapped up. I don't know if that's him promoting the fight, trying to get in Diaz's head, trying to give Diaz the impression that he's going to come in with the same approach when really he's trying something else, or if that is what Conor McGregor believes. If that's what he believes, then I think it's going to be really difficult for him to overcome Diaz, because that seemed to be the tone of his approach in the first fight. You could see when McGregor was fighting Diaz, you could just see the sort of one more punch mentality all over his face, and there was a moment of desperation for him in round 2. He had caught Nate Diaz with a huge body shot. He had sliced him open even more than he had in the first round with left hands. And then Nate shelled up, and Conor McGregor moved in and tried to throw some uppercuts up through his guard, and one connected, and Nate felt it, and the power wasn't there anymore. It had gone away. And there's a moment in this fight where a switch flips. Nate Diaz feels that uppercut and immediately starts taunting Conor McGregor, starts walking him down and coming after him. And Conor McGregor has his last desperate punch. He cracks Nate with a big left hand because Nate has gotten a little too overconfident, and Nate doesn't care. And that's basically the beginning of the end.
Yeah, so you can see in that series of exchanges right there, that Nate immediately, once he feels that uppercut, I know exactly the punch you're talking about. Yep. He immediately turns up the volume. So I went and counted strikes after that, and Nate had gone from throwing like 15 to 20, which is kind of his usual feeling you out, getting to know you kind of volume, to he throws 30 strikes in the minute after he feels that left hand. Then almost exactly a minute later is when he buzzes McGregor with that hard 1-2.
Yep.
And then in the 30 seconds after that, Nate throws 30 strikes.
Yeah.
So you can't get drawn into fighting at Nate Diaz's pace. Like, I think a sustainable pace for McGregor in this fight would be about 15 strikes a minute, like 13 to 15 strikes a minute, which is lower than he's usually lower than he likes. He likes to be somewhere like 18 to 22 if he can. I don't know if that's sustainable for him in this fight. I think something like he needs to be the one to slow this down. He needs to be the one controlling the range, because you could see, I actually don't know that it was the first round of that fight that really sunk McGregor. I think it was the first minute and a half or 2 minutes of the second round. Like, I think if he had gone back to sticking and moving and landing some kicks, occasionally jumping in with the left hand, I think he would have been fine gas tank wise as the second round wore on. Maybe he would have gassed out later, but instead he decided, okay, now it's time to finish him. He goes in there, he throws like 25 strikes in the first minute.
Did he predict a second round knockout?
I think he did, yeah.
Well, that might explain it.
Well, yeah. So he goes crazy trying to do this. He keeps leaping in. He keeps throwing shot after shot at full power. He abandons any semblance of rhythm or mixing things up. He almost exclusively headhunts. Aside from that one big body shot that he lands, he's almost exclusively headhunting.
He starts fighting Nate Diaz like he's hurt, like he has him hurt, when Nate hasn't actually shown any signs of being buzzed.
Yeah, at no point in that fight was Nate Nate. You can hit him and you can buzz Nate. But Nate didn't show any of that in this fight.
He reacts very well. I'm sure he was hurt by some of those shots. There's a point where in round 1 where he steps in with a 1-2 and McGregor hits him with a short overhand left, and it's the kind of punch that would knock a lot of other fighters out. I would not at all be surprised to hear that Nate was reeling when that happened, but he is a cleverer fighter than he seems. He's very stubborn and tough, and he is he's fundamentally sound. And so he recovers from those things very well. He stays moving. He stays defensively aware. He's just a good fighter. Why don't we take a quick break? When we come back, Pat, I want to talk a little more about Nate Diaz. I want to talk about what he does in this rematch. Most of the conversation, and for obvious reasons, focuses on Conor McGregor, and we will talk about him some more. But let's give a little shine to Nate. Let's talk about what he did right in that first fight and what makes him uniquely difficult for McGregor as an opponent. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. Welcome back to Heavy Hands. I have the unprofessionalism alarm silenced, aka my cell phone. You may have heard that during the beginning of last segment. It was my mom calling me, probably about some underwear, if anybody was curious. You know how it goes. Call her up. She'll probably show you a naked picture of me as a child or something like that. Classic mother stuff. But let's get back to the fight. The thing I want to say first about Nate Diaz, Pat, and I didn't realize this about him until the Michael Johnson fight. And I think maybe because he didn't learn this type of fighting before the Michael Johnson fight, he hadn't fully grasped it. But Nate Diaz is what might have been called in the old days a cute fighter, a cutie. And I know there are a few subsets of MMA fans who are already thinking that, but in originally cute comes from the word acute. And so back then it meant clever or shrewd. And in boxing it was even more specific. Cute fighters in boxing were not just technically sound, and sometimes they weren't even great technicians. They understood how to manipulate their opponents and the course of the fight. They were good bullshitters. They were difficult to hit cleanly. They were the kind of guys who could come in on short notice in unfriendly territory and beat or at least make a really good fighter look bad. And they're the fighters who frustrate you. You know, they have pestering offense, they have frustrating defense, and they understand the flow of the fight. And I think that's Nate Diaz. And Conor McGregor had a lot of difficulty with that because McGregor is used to he's used to opponents who kind of wear their emotions on their sleeves. He's used to opponents who partway through a fight become openly fearful of his power. He's used to opponents who he can frustrate either by talking to them or by fighting them or mocking them in the lead up to the fight. And Nate Diaz isn't that guy. Nate Diaz has a very systematic approach to fighting, and he's a much subtler fighter than he used to be. And I think that is really what makes him a uniquely difficult opponent for McGregor.
Well, so for so long, I think Nate was kind of hamstrung by the shadow of his brother and by comparisons to his brother. And we have to realize that, like, as much as we may want to treat them as a unit, because obviously they're siblings and because they've spent so long training together and all that, they are not the same fighter.
Yeah.
Nick is a pressure fighter or a swarmer. Nick is all about coming forward, getting on you, getting your back to the fence, and then unloading combination after combination after combination. 10, 12, 15, even 20 punches at a time. Nick will put on you. That's not Nate. Nate is a much, much different guy, and I think a big part of the reason Nate has come into his own, especially in the Johnson fight, but also in the McGregor fight, is because he's not trying to be his brother. He's not trying to be the pressure fighter and walk you down. Nate is an open space fighter. Nate does his best work in the middle of the cage when he can lace you with that jab, when he can lace you with the 1-2, and then when he can move afterwards. That's the big thing about Nate's game that I don't think people really realize is that Nate's footwork is absolutely outstanding.
Because Nick Diaz has bad footwork. People associate Diaz brothers with not having good footwork. Even just today, not to timestamp when we're recording this, but just recently, someone was saying to me, Conor's problem is that he fought with Nate, who's a great close quarters fighter, but Nate can't cut off the cage. I'm like, well, Nate doesn't really want to cut off the cage. I think you're conflating him with Nick Diaz. And I think that change really actually, not the Johnson fight, I think it really started to occur after the Josh Thompson fight. Because that was the last fight I can remember where Nate Diaz looked visibly frustrated, looked partway through the bout like he didn't know how to beat his opponent, and when he kind of tried to fight like Nick. He tried to walk Josh Thompson down, he tried to force the boxing range, and he couldn't make it happen. And it was after that, when Nate fought Gray Maynard, when I first said to myself, I think Nate is a better boxer than Nick. That was the first fight where I realized that he was a good outboxer. He had considerable pop, he had good straight punches, and he was more technical than I had realized before that time.
Well, and you could see him doing that or trying to do that against Rafael dos Anjos, but the knee injury was just kind of too much for him to overcome.
And dos Anjos too, the leg kicks, the kicking based game is a very different matchup than a guy like McGregor.
Yeah, well, but in that fight, in the first before the first takedown, like everything kind of changed when Dos Anjos was able to take Nate down and work him over from the top. Like Nate was losing the striking exchanges early in that fight, but he was holding his own. He landed a lot more strikes on Dos Anjos than I remembered the first couple of times I watched it. Like especially in exchanges, whenever Dos Anjos would come in, Nate was tagging him on the exits almost every time as Dos Anjos was getting in and out. Nate was forcing him to wear a right hook or wear a straight left on his way out.
Yeah.
So like you're right. It's been an ongoing transformation, but that movement is the key to it. Like it doesn't look like much if you're not looking for it, but notice every time after Nate throws or as Nate throws, he's moving. He's not a stationary fighter. So he throws a 1-2 and then he immediately pulls back. And that's why McGregor's counters missed.
Yeah.
Over and over and over. If Nate had been flat-footed, had been planted or after he was throwing the jab or the 1-2, McGregor would have hit him much more and much harder than he actually did. The problem was Nate throws the 1-2 and then he immediately takes a subtle back step. You throw your counter and he's not there anymore. Or he throws the 1-2, you try to counter, and he hits you with the check hook over the top of your left hand. He did that over and over again.
Rolls under and gets inside and smothers your shot, or he pivots to the side. I think what you said about Nate's footwork, it really kind of gets at the core of the style matchup here. Or not even the style matchup, just basically the defining traits of these two fighters. And that is that Nate's footwork doesn't stand out because it's fundamentally sound. Fundamentals rarely stand out. You got to have even jabs don't stand out when they're just fundamental. You have to be flashy with your jab and really emphasize the fact that you are out jabbing the shit out of someone for like casual fans of the sport to go, oh, wow, what a great jab. Fundamentals don't tend to stand out. What tends to stand out are dynamic attacks, athletic attacks, things like that Conor McGregor does, pulling these sort of karate stances, going for wheel kicks, working together, leaping left hook into right uppercut combinations. These big movements are what stand out, and that is kind of at the core of McGregor's style. Not that he's a fighter without subtlety, but especially in this style matchup, he is forced to rely, or was forced to rely, more on his athleticism, whereas Nate's footwork is small and subtle and efficient. There is a reason that Nate Diaz can go for 10 rounds without slowing down. And it's not just because he has great stamina like his brother. It's not just because he swims and bikes and runs and does all of that. It's because his style is designed to do that. That is what kind of makes him the lightweight division's most classically styled boxer, because everything is designed to control the fight.
Yeah, exactly. And it's fitting if we're going with the comparison to McGregor that the most unappreciated aspect of McGregor's game is his backstepping counter left.
Yeah.
It's the most underappreciated because it's the most subtle. Because you don't see him take that tiny little backward step with his right foot and pivot onto his left to land that punch across the plane of his opponent's body. Because you don't see that, you just see the big left hand and you see the impact. You don't see the tiny little technical trick that makes it work. But the irony is that one little trick, that one amazing thing that McGregor does better than absolutely anything else in his game, doesn't apply against Nate because Nate does such a good job of hiding his chin of hiding his chin behind his right shoulder, and of always having his feet under him, of always having some place to pull his head back to, so he's moving with the direction of the punch.
Yeah, and systematic. I think that is the word for what Nate Diaz did against Conor McGregor. McGregor won the first round. It wasn't as lopsided as some say, but McGregor definitely won the first round of their first encounter. The thing that stands out to me most about that round, though, is how Nate Diaz dealt with the fact that McGregor was hitting him. That is what allowed him to turn McGregor's success against him. That McGregor started going too hard for these big shots, reaching too much, and selling out for power and exhausting himself because he felt that he was hitting Nate, but he couldn't hurt him and he couldn't follow up. When Nate was getting hit, he would roll with the punch and move his head back to absorb the impact because he keeps a nice stance at almost all times. His back leg is ready, his knee bends, that force travels down into the floor and it dissipates. He doesn't take too much of the shock of the punch that lands. After he does that, he's got 2 or 3 options locked and loaded. He knows he can roll under, he knows he can pivot to the side, he knows he can come in and smother. And after he does one of those 3 moves, he's got 3 moves planned for each one. There is a flow chart sort of approach to Nate's defense. It's what Archie Moore called building bridges. And it was evident that Nate Diaz, with all of his experience and all the difficult fights he's had, understood that concept better than McGregor. McGregor was stringing his punches together, he was pressing the attack, but everything he did was more taxing. And especially when the end of the fight began, Nate hit McGregor when he wasn't ready to build bridges. He slipped and he was already ready with 1 counter, and he had done that slip uppercut about 10 times in the fight. He didn't have as many options at his disposal. His head movement was better than in his last fight, but it wasn't as deep and as nuanced as Nate's, even if, because of the athletic disparity, Nate started the fight being a lot easier to hit than McGregor. The fight itself, as it played out, revealed that there was more depth to Nate's game. He is a cuter fighter than Conor McGregor. He has more responses and a more consistent way to control an opponent, even on short notice, even without a training camp, even without as much power, and even against such a dynamic and destructive fighter.
Yeah, I mean, I think that their respective defense says a lot about the depth of each fighter's game. So Nate's defense is not based so much around not getting hit as not getting hit in ways that are really going to cause him problems.
Yes.
Whereas McGregor's defense is very binary. It's either I'm getting hit or I'm not getting hit. And so with Nate, you see a lot of we talked a lot about making sure that his legs are under him, making sure that his head is centered, moving moving with the punches as he's getting hit, hiding his chin behind his shoulder, using a forearm or a guard to kind of brush a punch aside. So like Nate is not by any stretch of the imagination impossible to hit. It's just very difficult to hit him in such a way that it's really going to pop him. Whereas McGregor is not necessarily easy to hit in the first place, but when he gets hit, he tends to get hit cleanly.
Yeah.
So like McGregor, especially before this last fight, I think we saw some real improvements to his head movement, was all about not being there to get hit. Yeah. Right, like he relied almost entirely on angles and distance to avoid his opponent's shot. We saw very little head movement from him, flashing hands a little bit of parrying, a little bit of blocking, but not very much at all. It was mostly just that he wasn't there for it. We saw better head movement from him in this fight, but again, that's based on the binary of either you're getting hit or you're not getting hit. There was very little rolling with the shot, very little trying to partially deflect the blow before it landed. So when he got into that fight with Nate at pace, when he agreed to fight at Nate's pace, like, yeah, he was landing, and he may have even been landing at the same rate, but he was eating clean shots, and Nate was eating kind of partially blocked ones.
Yeah. Yeah, and when Nate does get hit clean, he's got options afterwards to make sure that McGregor can't effectively follow up. When Nate managed to catch Conor clean and staggered him, Conor was backpedaling. That was basically his only response that he knew to go to. He started to kind of, and I think that's almost even more than just being rung by a shot, what started to lead to the end of the fight. He kind of started to panic because it's either, like you said, don't get hit or get hit and get hurt. And, you know, I think that's an experience thing. And while Nate Diaz doesn't have that much more fight experience than Conor McGregor, you could say that he's probably been training with better training partners for longer. He's been grappling for a longer time, I think, than McGregor. How much older is he than Conor?
3 years. I think Nate is like 3 months younger than I am, and McGregor I think is 3 years younger than I am.
Okay, so McGregor has not been. He's only been fighting since 2008. Nate's been fighting since 2004. Not quite regularly for the first 2 or 3 years, but McGregor only has 7 fewer fights than Nate Diaz, and he's fought a lot of elite competition. He's the featherweight champion. I think this is revealing of the sort of trap of being a puncher or a crazy athlete like Conor McGregor is. Because even if you have a similar amount of experience to your opponent, that experience hasn't necessarily taught you the same things. Nate Diaz's fights are almost always harder than Conor McGregor's. Even Conor McGregor's hardest fights are not close to as difficult as the worst losses and most hard-fought wins that Nate Diaz has endured. And so...
Yeah, well, Nate has been in there with a lot more unfavorable stylistic matchups than McGregor has.
Yeah,
like
I mean,
that.
just the fact that he's fought so many southpaws is just a tip of the iceberg there.
Yeah, I mean, Nate has fought a lot of guys who want to do things to him that do not match up well with his skill sets. And so he's been forced as a fighter to come up with solutions to those kinds of problems in ways that McGregor has not necessarily.
And
that's
and
not to say that
go on.
That's not to say that McGregor hasn't fought tough competition. It's just been competition that where you talked a lot about what has your experience taught you, Conor, and I think you're exactly right, because what Nate's experience has taught him is that I need to change what I think I want to do going in, whereas Conor's experience has taught him if I do what I want to do, it's going to work out.
Yes, Conor's experience has taught him that his opponents can't beat him if he presses the attack, if he works hard, if he does what comes naturally. And Nate's experience has taught him that fights are hard. Nate was on. Two things about Nate Diaz seem really telling to me regarding this matchup. One is that immediately after the fight, he went to the post-fight interview and he said some amazing things. I'm not surprised, motherfuckers being probably the best example, but one of the more subtle things he said really stood out to me, and it was that he didn't have his training camp, he didn't have a lot of sparring, so he expected to start slow and warm up, and it happened sooner than he thought it would. That, to me, is bad news for Conor McGregor. That Nate Diaz had his face all cut up, he was taking clean punches, McGregor tried his hardest to finish him, especially when he felt himself fading, and that Diaz had expected it to take twice as long for him to actually turn the fight around. The other thing that stands out to me about Nate Diaz is that he went on Conan O'Brien, and he talked about something that I've heard from George St. Pierre. He talked about accepting the worst possible outcome. Nate Diaz's experience has taught him that there are bad outcomes. Even for a guy as durable as he is, with that legendary Diaz chin, he's been knocked out. He's been brutalized and beaten up. He has been outmatched athletically. He has been outskilled. He has come into fights injured and out of shape and had a rough time. And he told Conan O'Brien on the show that he goes into every fight saying to himself, I'm probably going to get knocked out. And then when it doesn't happen, it's like a pleasant surprise to him. And that's something I remember hearing from GSP. GSP used to say, or maybe Firas Zahabi said this of GSP, that the key to being a dominant fighter, the key to overcoming adversity, is to make your peace with the worst possible outcome before the fight happens. So when Nate Diaz is being tagged by Conor McGregor, when he's getting hurt, he's thinking, what's the worst that can happen? I've experienced it before. Better than even having made his peace with it is the fact that he has been through it. And he knows it's not actually that bad. He knows he can come back and still make improvements. Conor McGregor hasn't been through that in years and years and years. Not since he was so inexperienced that he can easily excuse the fact that he lost.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think that plays into how each fighter needs to go about winning this fight. We talked a lot about that experience and McGregor having to kind of overcome his instincts and that's the essence of what a successful game plan for him looks like in this fight, is that it's all based around having to overcome his natural instincts and his natural tendencies to overcome the lessons that he has taught himself through his success in previous fights.
Yeah.
Because you can't go into a fight with Nate Diaz thinking, I'm going to knock this guy out in 2 rounds. That is like, even if it happens, that is a terrible way of approaching it. That would be a bad process, even if the outcome ended up being favorable to you.
And you said this the other day, Pat. You basically said the question here is Conor McGregor a truly great fighter? Is he really great, or is he, at the very least, is he greater than the style matchup? Because that's the thing, is to beat Nate Diaz, Conor McGregor, like you said, he has to overcome something that is innately difficult for him, more so than we ever realized. But even when Nate Diaz came in on short notice, I think most of us said Nate would be a tough style matchup for Conor if only he had more than a week to prepare.
Yeah, exactly. Like, so what I meant when I said you have, like, if you're going to pick McGregor in this fight, you're banking on his greatness. You're saying, okay, I acknowledge that this is a difficult stylistic matchup for him. I acknowledge that he cannot win this fight just doing what he would normally want to do in any given fight,
but not consistently. I mean, he could definitely knock Nate out. That is absolutely a distinct possibility.
Yeah, he could do that, but it is not but that is not a process-driven way for him to go about winning.
And in fact, if he were to bank on that happening, it would probably look exactly the same as the first fight.
Almost exactly like it, where with him punching himself out, getting tired, Nate finding a way to get on top and then finishing him on the mat. That's like, if he fights that way, that is almost certainly what's going to happen. Maybe he gets lucky, maybe one out of 6 or 1 out of 8 times, if he goes in there with that particular goal in mind, maybe it works. But I don't think that that's McGregor. I think that he's going to try and come in and play a more process-driven game where he's kicking and moving, and picking his spots to try and leap in with the big left hand to really score in those circumstances. So that's what a successful game plan looks like for him in this fight. But can he do that with Nate Diaz hitting him over and over and over again, with Nate wagging his finger in his face, with Nate trying to drag him into the kind of fight that Conor McGregor would prefer to be in? Can he overcome his natural instincts and his tendencies? If he can, then I think that makes him a true all-time great fighter, to be able to overcome all that in a matchup that doesn't suit you at all, in the kind of already having lost to this guy once by doing what you wanted to do. Like, if he can do that, then I think that makes him a true great.
Yeah. So what's your final prediction for this fight, Pat?
Well, so I just real quick, I want to point out that the contrast there is that Nate doesn't have to fight against his tendencies. Nate just needs to embrace his tendencies.
Right. Like, Nate has to do exactly what he did in the first fight, except, as he said, not get touched as much because he has a full training camp.
Exactly. Yeah. So, like, all Nate has to do is embrace himself, whereas McGregor has to fight himself.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
So with all of that said, I could see McGregor doing that, but I don't think that he can do it for 5 rounds. I think that at some point he's going to get drawn into fighting Nate's fight, and I think when that happens, he's going to get himself in trouble. And he's either going to start losing rounds handily, or he's going to end up getting touched up, knocked down, submitted again. So I would say either Diaz by late stoppage or Diaz by decision, with the strong caveat that, like, it would not at all surprise me if McGregor really did have that kind of true greatness in him.
Yeah, and you know, there are so many ways that McGregor could come in with a still slightly imperfect approach and still beat Nate Diaz. He is that spectacular of a fighter. He's that talented. He's that dangerous. He could totally stop Nate Diaz on cuts. That's something that, you know, had that fight gone on and Nate hadn't stung Conor, would his face have been able to keep taking the damage even if his chin was holding up? We don't know. The right side of his face was pretty brutally beaten and bruised and sliced and bloodied by the second round of that fight. So we don't know. Could he have been knocked out? Absolutely. He was stung by some really hard shots, and if Conor McGregor comes in here with any better semblance of how to fight a long southpaw with a good jab, he will almost certainly land some better, cleaner shots a little more consistently than he did the first time around. But to really do... To come into this fight and not rely on something happening that prevents Nate Diaz from doing his game, to rely on outfighting Nate Diaz, like you said, Conor McGregor would have to make some pretty drastic changes. I think he's good enough to attempt them. I think he's good enough to show some different tactics. I'm not quite sure that he's great enough to overcome the style matchup just yet. Like you, I would not be surprised. I could totally see Conor McGregor winning this fight, but I think that and you said it brilliantly, Pat, I really can't outdo the way you said it. Conor McGregor has to fight himself. He has to confront himself to win this fight. He can't rely on his backstepping counter game. He can't rely on pressuring with his southpaw tactics the same way he did in all of his fights leading up to this. He has to do something different, something that, by all logic and reason would seem to be against his base tendencies, while Nate Diaz has to go in there and be a long, tireless boxer with a good ground game to fall back on. And Nate may very well come in with some improved tactics of his own. He may come in expecting to clinch more with McGregor because he had some success there in the first fight. He may try to wrestle McGregor down with his kicks to prepare for the fact that Conor may have honed his kicking game so that he doesn't have to box with Nate. We don't really know until it happens, but no matter what Nate does, it's probably going to be Nate doing Nate. And I think that is just a more favorable situation for the Diaz brother than it is for the Notorious. So I'm picking Nate Diaz, with uncertainty. But that's the game, right? We're always uncertain. We never know until it happens. All right, so that wraps up our discussion of McGregor versus Diaz 2. When we come back from this next break, we're going to discuss some of the other notable fights on this card that I mentioned before, namely Anthony Johnson versus Glover Teixeira, Rick Story versus Donald Cerrone, and Cody Garbrandt versus Takeya Mizugaki. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And welcome back. Let's lead off, Pat, with the light heavyweight showdown here, our co-main event of UFC 202, Anthony Johnson versus Glover Teixeira. This one is, I have more confliction about this bout than I think most people do, because I can absolutely see in my mind Glover Teixeira beating Anthony Johnson. Whether I can pick him to do it is another question, but I can see him winning, whereas most people seem to have accepted that it's a foregone conclusion that Rumble is going to get the win.
Oh, I don't think that it's a foregone conclusion at all. Like, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. Well, because they both like to pressure, they both like to move forward. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens when Rumble isn't the guy who can immediately count on being more aggressive in a matchup. I think that Glover is going to push him back, and he's going to force Rumble to work outside of his comfort zone and outside of his wheelhouse.
Probably. Glover, I think, has pressured even more consistently than Johnson. I think it's the threat of power that Anthony Johnson's opponents tend to start their fights with him backing up. Glover Teixeira has clashed with a few guys who want to come forward and forced them to move backwards. So I can absolutely see him coming in here and expecting that to be the way out for him. And then we have to, of course, take into account the fact that Teixeira has out-grappled opponents in the past. He's got very solid wrestling by light heavyweight standards. So too does Anthony Johnson. And Glover's probably not quite as good as Daniel Cormier. In fact, I know he's not as good as Daniel Cormier with his takedown game. But in some ways, this matchup seems to me like... Ooh, in some ways...
There goes Lucy.
There goes Lucy. In some ways, this matchup seems to me like a reenactment of Glover Teixeira versus Ovince St. Preux with a much better version of Ovince St. Preux. We have a very athletic fighter who seems to be kind of a front runner, has had issues with quitting late in fights, or at least sort of mentally breaking as his opponents keep applying the pressure. A powerful fighter with a good countering game who is not as skilled on the ground and is somewhat susceptible to submissions. That's kind of the matchup, except that Anthony Johnson's also much better in all the areas that Ovince St. Preux is, and Ovince St. Preux still managed to find early success against Glover Teixeira.
Yeah, I mean it's like that, except for the fact that Johnson is just much better at absolutely everything
Yeah.
than Oven St. Preux
Yeah.
is. Like he works at a quicker pace. He's a sharper. He also likes to counter like St. Preux does, but he's a much sharper counter puncher, much more technically sound. Works at a better pace. Is a drastically better wrestler
Yeah.
than Oven St. Preux is. And so that to me is why I'm picking Johnson here, is
Yeah.
because I think that like as much trouble as Teixeira got himself into against St. Preux, he's not going to be able to get him out of it just simply by virtue of being the drastically superior wrestler.
Yeah,
Like,
my feeling is kind of the same. I can see Glover hanging in there tough or cracking Anthony Johnson with a good counter or a good left hook while pressuring him to turn the tide. And if that is what happens, then I think his skill set is more than enough to overcome a mentally weakened Anthony Johnson. But if Johnson comes in here and has the fight more or less in his control, or at least has good trained responses to Teixeira that are working from the very beginning, then that St. Preux match, it was too close for Teixeira for me to be confident that he can beat, as you said, a substantially better version of that kind of athletic power puncher.
yeah, I mean, it's a really good fight. I think it's going to be really entertaining for as long as it lasts. But I don't think that there's a fighter in that division, including Daniel Cormier, who can eat a lot of clean shots from Rumble and hope to make that work. Like Cormier's chin is special. Cormier's toughness is special. Cormier's mindset is special. And I think it took every single ounce of that to overcome the beating that Johnson put on him early in that fight and work through it. I don't think that Teixeira has the wrestling skills or at this point in his career the durability to walk through those same kinds of shots over and over.
Yeah, I tend to agree. So why don't we talk about the fight which is taking place just before that, welterweight showdown between Rick Story, Donald Cerrone. Cowboy hasn't moved up quite as much as Conor McGregor, but he is still a relative newcomer to the welterweight division. I think this is just his third foray into the 170-pound limit. And, once against Alex Oliveira on pretty short notice. Once against Patrick Cote, a fight which we both thought was very impressive and talked about not long ago on this show. And now against Rick Story, who I think is probably in a better place, not only as a welterweight, but as a fighter, than either of those two guys. So this is basically Donald Cerrone's first real test at welterweight. This is the first fight against someone who has made their bones in this division and represents a tough stylistic matchup for him. What do you think? How do you think it goes down?
Well, so I think you hit on it by mentioning that this is a tough stylistic matchup, right? Like because Story is fundamentally a come forward, aggressive pressure fighter, and that is historically what has given Cerrone problems, right? Like it's been guys who will walk through his kicks, who can get into his punching range, who can push him back to the fence, who can take advantage of his kind of upright stance and his porous defense. Those have been the guys who have given him problems, going all the way back to Nate Diaz, Benson Henderson. Guys like that have always been a struggle for him. And Story, like the game plan is out there. You know what Story is going to have to do and what he's going to try to do against Cerrone. To me, the difference here between now and those other fights is Cerrone now looks like a legitimate welterweight. He's got a ton of speed at 170. He's going to give up a little bit of size, but like against Cote, he looked like a legitimate welterweight and not like he did against Oliveira, where he looked like a blown up lightweight. Like it looks like he's put on size, he's put on strength, he's embracing the fact that he's getting older and what that means for him physically. He's adding skills. He's much more willing and able to exchange in the pocket. He's using his takedown game really effectively against guys who try to pressure him. The second you overextend, he ducks under and hits that takedown. And I think that those things are going to be the difference here. I think those are good answers when you have guys who try to pressure you. The ability to duck under and hit takedowns, the ability to stay in the pocket and exchange with a puncher who wants to throw at you like Story does. That to me is going to be what he needs to get this done. Because Story, despite being a wrestler, does not have like A-plus takedown defense. He never has. Pretty much everybody who's really tried has been able to get him down to put him on his back, and I don't think that Cerrone will be an exception to that rule.
Yeah, it's an interesting test of the improvements that Cerrone has basically been trying to make for years now. I think going back to his fight with maybe Jim Miller It's crazy how long ago that seems. It was actually very recent, but it's like 10 fights down his record because the guy fights so much. But going back to his fight with Jim Miller, maybe the one with Adriano Martins, we started to see some real improvements in the areas that Cerrone had struggled with throughout his career. Not coincidentally, I think that was about the time that I think Brandon Gibson started to really seriously take over a lot of the striking training responsibilities at Jackson Winklejohn, and when Cerrone had an unexpectedly dominant performance against Patrick Cote, a fight that both you and I expected to be pretty tough for him, I asked on Twitter, when did Donald Cerrone get that good? And Brandon Gibson responded with a wink. So I think he's happy to claim some responsibility for Donald Cerrone's improvements, and that's a great thing for Donald, because he has had, for a guy with such a consistently successful career with so many great wins, he has also consistently had the same weaknesses for years and years and years, going back to the Nate Diaz fight, and even before then, but that was the first time it was really, really pressed. Going back to that Nate Diaz fight, then Anthony Pettis, then Rafael dos Anjos, and then Rafael dos Anjos again. All four of his last four losses have come about by similar circumstances. Somebody pressured him, somebody started fast, and somebody basically made him anxious from the very beginning of the bout. And the ability to roll and slip, the ability to pivot and move side to side, the ability to punctuate these movements with good counter punches, that's a big thing for Cerrone. That'll be really helpful for him going forward, because that allows him to mitigate the effects of tough style matchups. That being said, he still got absolutely shit-kicked by Rafael dos Anjos when they fought. I don't think Rick Story is probably as powerful as Rafael dos Anjos, though being a welterweight, he may be closer than we realize because he's typically fighting other 170-pounders. He's not got the exact same game, but he can pressure, he is strong, he throws in volume, and he doesn't mind being hit. He shares a lot of the same traits of the last guy to beat Cerrone, and the last guy to beat Cerrone, despite the market improvements he's shown in his last two fights, the last guy to beat Cerrone did so in absolutely emphatic fashion. And so I think this one will be a lot closer than that fight, but I think Rick Story is going to pressure and throw enough volume to win an early round against Cerrone and then kind of maintain that pace while Cerrone regains his bearings and does better as the fight goes on.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing for me is like these changes that Cerrone has made are not massive changes, but they have a massive effect on the overall outlines of his game. Like he's lighter on his feet. He moves more laterally. He's not quite as flat-footed. His punches are actually a thing that you need to worry about now. He can scare guys off a little bit more than he used to be able to.
I think that's the first thing I noticed in new version of Donald Cerrone is that he was actually adding some punching power. That really stood out to me. Like when he actually all the way back to when he fought KJ Noons, it stood out. I was like, Donald Cerrone looks like he's getting bigger and stronger and hitting harder. That was when Donald Cerrone started to actually, despite being a great kickboxer for so many years, that was when he started to become a knockout artist, because he was actually hurting guys badly enough on the feet that he didn't need to choke them out after they fell down.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's that. I just feel like Dos Anjos as a pressure fighter is like, it's easy to understate the athleticism and the power that Dos Anjos have, and I think that makes him really special and a uniquely difficult matchup for Cerrone in ways that a lot of the other guys that he's fought are not. Like if Story can get him into the clinch and get him against the fence, then I think Story is an absolute handful for him. But Story does not hit that hard. He doesn't. I don't think he hits as hard shot for shot as Dos Anjos does. He's definitely not as fast, and he's definitely not as like balls to the wall aggressive as Dos Anjos is. And so I think that gives Cerrone more time to move, more distance to move, and I think it allows him to play a stick and move game more effectively than he could against Dos Anjos.
Yeah, probably. I think it'll be close. Typically, the thing is that typically when Donald Cerrone loses, he gets destroyed. It's most of his losses, the ones that really stand out in our memories at least, are very one-sided. Both of the Dos Anjos fights, the first one I think was more one-sided than people actually thought at the time. I didn't think Cerrone had a lot going for him, and really just physically looked, his body language was bad, even if he came back pretty well at the end of that fight. And then the Anthony Pettis fight and the Nate Diaz fight before that, somewhat competitive again in the Diaz fight, but mostly they're pretty one-sided. They're pretty dominant performances on the parts of his opponents. And I don't think this is going to be that. But I think this is going to be more like the Ben Henderson fight. I think we're going to see Cerrone against a southpaw, a more aggressive one than Ben Henderson. And I'm talking about the third fight, by the way, which I did think Ben Henderson deserved to win, though it was close. And that's the thing. I think Cerrone's going to hang in there. I think he's going to be better equipped to deal with the southpaw stance, the pressure, the power. But I think Rick Story has been criminally underrated for a long, long time. And I think he's a lot better than people give him credit for. I thought he looked good even while shaking off ring rust in his fight with Tarek Saffiedine. I think he's going to look even better here against a guy less experienced than Saffiedine at fighting against that kind of style, that kind of pressuring style, less skilled even with his improvements. So I wouldn't be surprised. And I don't think you would be shocked if Rick Story won either.
No, absolutely not, because then it would be basically a reversion to type for Cerrone.
Yeah,
and reversions to type never really surprised me all that much.
It's something that could absolutely happen. Story's big and physically strong. Donald Cerrone is quick, more powerful than ever, and more skilled. So we will see. It's a really well-matched bout, and I'm looking forward to it. But I am riding with Rick Story. So finally, very quickly, Pat, let's touch on Cody Garbrandt versus Takeya Mizugaki. Both of us thought Tomas Almeida was going to beat Cody Garbrandt, although we acknowledge that he was dangerous. In fact, Tomas's issue with being hurt early in fights bit him. Garbrandt was a little more aggressive than usual, threw more combinations, came after Almeida almost from the beginning of the fight, and knocked him out in the first round. Now he gets to step up against a more durable and more experienced opponent in Takeya Mizugaki, one whose luck lately hasn't been as great as Tomas Almeida's, but one who has basically only ever lost to very good fighters. Takeya Mizugaki, throughout his career, for many years, he was win-loss, win-loss, win-loss. But the losses were to Miguel Torres, Scott Jorgensen, Uriah Faber, Brian Bowles. Chris Carriasso was the one that kind of broke the mold, but then he went on a great run, and again, only lost to Aljamain Sterling and Dominic Cruz. You have to be good to beat Takeya Mizugaki, and even just being an elite fighter is no assurance of victory. So how do you think Garbrandt comes out here?
Well, so it's really interesting, like especially after spending time at Team Alpha Male like a week and a half ago. I don't know how much better Cody Garbrandt can get if he just stays there.
Yeah.
But at this point, I think he is so physically overwhelming and physically dominant. He is so fast. He hits so hard. Like, I just don't know what Mizugaki can do. Mizugaki is going to need every bit of his durability. He's got to stay tough. He's got to hope that Garbrandt somehow exhausts himself, which is not a problem we've ever seen from Garbrandt. He's got to work takedowns against a guy who has absolutely outstanding takedown defense. Like, it's just a really tall order for him. I don't know if Garbrandt is the future champion in this division. It's entirely possible that he is. I just don't think that Mizugaki at this stage of his career, he's now 13 years in, he's got a ton of experience, he's been in a lot of really tough fights. I don't know if his chin can stand up to Garbrandt's power. I expect Garbrandt to knock him out.
Yeah, I could see it being a little like the Francisco Rivera fight, where the puncher has a difficult time with the... Mizugaki's not a bad boxer. That has to be said right here. He's an underrated striker. He's pretty crafty. And I think he hits harder than anyone's ever given him credit for as well. I think he has that sneaky power that doesn't stand out because he's not a finisher. If you look at his record, Mizugaki, when he hurts you, he's going to take you down and beat you up from guard, or he's going to stall you against the fence, or he's just going to maintain his pace. He doesn't have killer instinct, but he's a pretty good boxer, and it tends to sting when he hits you. And that allowed him to beat Francisco Rivera, but I don't know that Garbrandt has Rivera's same very predictable tendency to brawl when he gets in trouble. I don't know that he is as fragile as Rivera seems to be, as easy to hurt in exchanges. And I think he's probably at least, if not more powerful, and has the youth and athleticism on his side. So I'm going to go with Garbrandt. I wouldn't be shocked if Mizugaki beat him. Mizugaki is still a good fighter. I thought he looked just as good as he looked against Rivera and Eric Perez in his most recent fight against George Roop. And Roop is another underrated fighter as well. But I do think that Garbrandt will probably catch Mizugaki. He has been knocked out. He was starched pretty recently by Dominic Cruz. And so we know he's not invulnerable. And Cody Garbrandt is he's at a stage in his career where he's Mizugaki is not a good enough opponent that Garbrandt can't go in there and fight stupidly and still beat him. You know what I mean? Like, it's not, experience is not a guaranteed fail-safe for Mizugaki in this fight, because he's not that tough. He's not that well matched against a guy like Garbrandt. That Garbrandt can't go in there, even with a terrible game plan and no technical improvements, and just swing really hard and knock him out. So...
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on something really important there. That like that Garbrandt's athleticism and his power and just sheer off the charts physicality give him a lot of margin for error, even against a crafty opponent like Mizugaki.
It's like Conor McGregor, and that's why it may be difficult for Garbrandt to improve technically as a fighter, because like McGregor, fighters with those athletic gifts or that natural power. I mean, why improve? You know, why? How can you possibly see the importance of fundamentals when you are clearly doing just fine the way you are, knocking out everybody you face? But
yeah, it would be a little different, I think, if Mizugaki were more dangerous.
Yeah,
because Mizugaki does have some power, and I can see. Like, I think the real issue for Garbrandt in this fight is going to be if he gets into brawls, if he gets into exchanges. Mizugaki is real crafty in exchanges.
Yes.
Like, I think it could look a lot like Brad Pickett versus Tomas Almeida,
sure.
where Garbrandt comes in thinking, I'm going to get this guy out of there, and then he ends up eating a few clean left hooks from a guy who has a lot of craft in the kinds of spaces where experience makes a big difference.
Yeah.
But it's not, I don't see this falling into the kind of prospect loss category unless Garbrandt totally runs out of ideas, just because I don't think Mizugaki can capitalize even if he does that. Like, where we see prospects run into trouble in these kinds of matchups is where the other guy can make them really, really pay for their mistakes in an instant, you know, whether that's with a big punch or whether that's with, I think more often submissions.
Yeah, they're against opportunists, and Takei Mizugaki can create opportunities, but like I said, he's not that great at pouncing on them. The real question for me, Pat, is going into this match, what kind of fruit will Cody Garbrandt compare Takei Mizugaki's hands to? That's the real question.
I'm thinking nectarines, ripe nectarines.
You couldn't have picked a funnier fruit. Nectarines are perfect. Do nectarines have a pit in the middle?
I don't have the slightest
if
fucking
they
idea.
Do,
I was going to say something and I just realized I don't have the slightest idea.
If they do, it's actually perfect for Mizugaki, because they're harder than you think they are and they can crack your teeth, but really they're still kind of soft and squishy.
Well, so for the sake of our metaphor here, let's just hope that nectarines do in fact have pits.
Let's hope that they do. They're not tiny oranges, are they? They're not clementines. They're like peaches, right?
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Big nectarine is going to be coming after us after this broadcast here, Connor.
Powerful corporation. For those who don't know what we're talking about, by the way, Cody Garbrandt has amazingly bad trash talking, and he recently did an interview in which he said that Dominic Cruz has grapes for hands. By which I think he had a sort of a portmanteau of trash talk there, where he confused couldn't bust a grape with has feathers or pillows for hands. And he just combined them. So Dominic Cruz now has grapes for hands, which is simultaneously the worst and best piece of trash talk I've ever heard in my life.
Garbrandt is bad enough at trash talk that he makes TJ Dillashaw sound like Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, even Big Daddy Uriah Faber was shaking his head at that one. Not even Uriah Faber. Uriah Faber had better lines. Check the record, bud. So anyway, that wraps it up. We'll end on a jovial note. Why not? Pat, what do you have coming out this week, the week of UFC 202, that you want to tell the people listening about?
Oh, buddy, I got a lot. I have a complete breakdown of Nate Diaz versus Conor McGregor coming out on Bleacher Report. Then I have two pieces on the Washington Post. I have a kind of a breakdown of Nate Diaz's game with a few comments on a good game plan for him against McGregor. Then I have a breakdown of Conor McGregor's game where I go into a little more depth about what he would need to do to win this fight. I have my usual complete guide up on Bleacher Report. And let's see, I think that's all fight related. But then also, if you check the podcast feed for the Fall of Rome podcast, episode 2 is up. Please give that a listen. I would really appreciate it. Otherwise, that's about it. What are you doing, Connor?
Well, I too am doing some similar stuff. Not surprising with such a fight of this magnitude, a fight of such magnitude on the horizon. I am doing both Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz breakdowns this week, some pretty in-depth technical and strategic analysis of what these guys are good at and what they can do to overcome the other. And if you missed it last week, I had a follow-up to my very popular Puncher's Path piece One of the favorite pieces I've ever written, and I'm really proud of the follow-up as well. It's about 3,500 words in which I compare Conor McGregor's sort of lust for the knockout to a similar situation faced by a boxer named Bobby Chacon, one of the most popular and most exciting fighters you will ever see. A guy who had more action fights and more thrilling knockouts than almost anyone you can think of. And it was actually on August 20th, 1977, 39 years ago to the day, that that Bobby Chacon overcame the guy who beat him twice, who used craft and experience to beat him. 39 years later to the day, Conor McGregor will be attempting to do the same thing to Nate Diaz, the only guy in the modern incarnation of his career to have had his number. So I think there's a good parallel there. I'm very happy with the piece. Check that one out. Full Sherdog preview of UFC 202, and I think that's just about it. But this show has been a pleasure. We hope that you guys enjoyed it, especially I'm assuming we've got some new people listening today, so thank you very much for joining us. Stick around. The show is even better than this usually. It actually is 100 times better on every other episode, so stick around. Don't make this the only one that you hear. Otherwise, thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion as much as we did. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.